Hello everybody, my name is EK, you're watching EK Tech and welcome back to the channel. So today we're talking about a game called Dauntless. In the background you can see the settings I'm running for the first part of this benchmark video. You can see I'm running pretty much everything at high and I do have anti-aliasing at low. This is because in games like these, at a high resolution, I'm running at 3440 by 1440. Anti-aliasing is just a complete waste of resources because it does absolutely nothing for graphical fidelity. So at the start of this video, I'm going to be running around the town for just a little bit, and you can see I'm sitting at about 110 FPS. We'll dive into more stats as the video proceeds. The reason I didn't go for Ultra, by the way, at the start, I'm going to cover that later in the video, is because usually in games like these, high is pretty much the max setting. You can go to Ultra and you will see some very minor graphical increases in terms of quality, but the thing that happens is you get like 5% more graphical fidelity for like 20% more GPU and CPU usage usually, so it's usually not worth it. Okay, so I'm very quickly jumping into the settings. This is because I wanted to change the FOV slider to see what kind of difference it made. Now, honestly, going back to the game, I can't really see any difference. Perhaps there is a difference that I'm just not seeing. But honestly, the FOV slider doesn't seem to do a whole lot. Maybe that's because I'm running ultra-wide. Maybe it doesn't scale that well. But just something I noticed. So as we're moving into the boss fight, let me start talking a bit more about what the game is actually showing us. We have graphs on the left side. I am displaying my GPU usage at the top left. We have the VRAM usage just below that. Then we have all my CPU cores. I'm running an 8-core 16-thread CPU. I'm just dropping off here. Don't mind my horrible gameplay, by the way, guys. I am very new to this game still, so don't judge me. It's just about the stats. So you can see that all my cores are being tasked very minimally. You can see that a lot of cores are sitting at 3%, 9%, 6%, 11%, 13%. So the game doesn't really seem to take a lot of advantage of all of my cores. Now a couple of cores seem to be jumping up into like the 80s, into the 90s, so this game doesn't seem to utilize core scaling all that well. But it doesn't really seem to matter for the simple reason that we are capping out our GPU performance. So what this means is when my GPU is sitting at around about 100%, right now it's at 98 to 99%, which is pretty much capped out. This means that the GPU is rendering all the frames it can possibly render. So even if the CPU were to be sending, let's say, double the amount of frames to my GPU, it still wouldn't matter because the GPU would be incapable of rendering more frames, and thus the frame rate would remain intact. Now this means that since the Ryzen 2700X, the CPU I'm running, isn't very good in terms of single core performance, and I'm still capping out at 1080 Ti, the game really does not need that great of a CPU, because the GPU seems to be the bottleneck when you go to higher settings. Now later on in the video I will be going into even higher settings just to see what happens. You can very clearly see we are sitting at around about 80 FPS, which is pretty solid all things considered, because I'm running this game sort of maxed out, everything at high, which in general terms is sort of maxed out. We are running at 3440 by 1440 once again, and the game's running super smooth, guys. It's buttery smooth. When I started up the game I did have some issues, by the way. I did have some issues with some choppiness, but for some reason that had to do with me running the game in windowed full screen. Upon swapping to full screen, the game all of a sudden ran very well. It ran super clean, and as you can see from the video in the background, there is pretty much no drops in FPS at all, at least not into like the 60s area. Now as you can see, my FPS is superseding the 62 mark. The game is generally locked at 62 FPS, which is a bit of an odd number, but I guess that's just the way I did it. And there's a way to remove it. If you just Google for removing the FPS cap, you'll find the solution. So here, guys, I'm moving everything up to Epic. I was just like, you know what? Let me just bump up every single thing to Epic just to see what happens. And you can see that my CPU still is being tasked generally at about 20%. That's the stat. The bottom CPU one, you can see CPU 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. all the way through to 16. And just below 16, you can see CPU, which is the average CPU usage, like the total CPU usage, and it's sitting at around about 20%. So that means my CPU isn't being tasked at all. You can very clearly see that CPU core number 5 seems to be the heavily tasked core. That seems to be the single core that's working very hard, and you can see it's sitting at mid 80s right now, so that is really where the performance is coming from, and it's leveraging some stuff to the other cores, but really it's you know, it's almost nothing. So you can see we are dropping into the low 60s, but it's still fairly solid. We haven't dropped into the 50s at all, I do believe, which is still pretty good, all things considered. Now, in terms of graphic quality, I couldn't really notice any difference between going for a high and ultra, or epic as it's called in this game. So if you're running a high refresh monitor and you want to have like the solid FPS at 100 or 144 or anywhere higher than 60, I very much recommend you turn it down to high or maybe even medium or something, just to make sure you get proper FPS, because the game seems to look pretty cool even if you're running it at low. So the graphics settings really don't matter that much in terms of how the game looks, so just make sure you're optimizing it properly for your specific FPS needs and you should be fine. Now, if we take a look at the RAM, which is the one below CPU, you can see I'm sitting at around about 8 GB of RAM. Now, my system has a total of 32 GB of RAM, and it isn't being pushed above 8,000 megabytes at all, so 8 GB. This means that you should be fine with a reasonably small amount of RAM. Now, the way RAM works is, let's say I have 8 GB of RAM and a game requires 11 generally. Then the game wouldn't run well. But what happens if the game only requires 8 and I have 16? Well, there is a pretty decent chance that the RAM usage, wow, that's a hot word apparently, is going to jump up all the way to like 11 or 12, because if there's more RAM available, your system will try and take advantage of the excess RAM you have available in order to properly run. So this means that even though it's displaying I'm running at around 8 GB of RAM, it is very much possible that if I had only 8 GB of RAM, it would still run perfectly fine, and maybe even with 4. So this comes to the answer that you only need about 8 GB, preferably 16 for smooth running, especially with stuff in the background. Anyway guys, I think I've covered pretty much everything there is. The footage I had is actually done right now, so thank you very much for watching. I hope I've answered any questions you may have. I hope this video clears up anything you might want to know about the performance of this game with these specific settings, with this specific hardware. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below and tell me what it is I can help you with. I'm very much into answering comments. Thank you very much for watching guys, have a nice day, and I'll see you around.